Welcome to another episode of the Wandering Watercolor. Let's paint. Okay, so this is the next page in the Majestic Horses watercolor coloring book. And as always, you want to have a scrap piece of paper. It's not necessary, but it helps. We may not use it during this page. A brush, any brush is really helpful. It doesn't have to be anything fancy or expensive. And have a paper towel or a rag. Some of the colors here, my palette, and place to mix your colors along with some. I have off camera here. I have some jars of water. Basically, I'll leave everything that I use. I'll just leave it underneath the video, and then if you ever have questions, just shoot me a message. But this, unlike the previous one that we painted, this is going to be a black horse. Now, animals that have black fur are notoriously difficult to paint, mainly because it's difficult to show the details. But I'm going to show you a trick. So the first thing that you want to do, we're going to mix our black color for the body. And the way we do that is we're going to grab brown, and because we have to use it for the base of the entire body, we're going to mix a good amount so that we have plenty to work with. And so the first thing is we're adding a lot of water, a lot of brown, and then we'll get some of the teal. By the way, if you have blue or green, just kind of mix them together in your palette. You can use whatever palette you want to get to these colors. It doesn't have to be the exact same thing as mine. Basically, brown and blue give you a kind of nice organic looking gray, and if you oversaturate it with both of the colors, it gets closer to black. Now I'm throwing in a little bit of the cobalt blue. The cobalt blue is less saturated, more earthy looking, which will help with the mixture. So this is where we can use our spare piece of paper, and you can use any piece, even if it's like just a regular printer paper. You can, because the whole purpose of it is just to test the color. So it doesn't have to be anything fancy. So this looks like a decent color. Now, what normally you don't want to use any black straight out of the tube, just because it does give it a more synthetic look. In this case, we already have our color pre-mixed. Now I'm just going to add a little bit of the black. You actually don't have to do this step if you don't want to. But what we'll do is, once we have the base color laid in, for the mane, we will use the straight black color. Just because hair itself, whether it's on people or on animals, when it's fine, long hair, it actually does look a little synthetic, and it helps if you give that extra color in there, especially if it's really dark. So that's perfect right there. Now, we want to add more water because we don't want it to be too saturated. Like, we'll leave a lot of the saturated color right here, and then next to it we'll add more water because the first wash, we want it to be lighter so that when we go back in to add the shadows, there's a contrast between the two. So probably need a lot more water just because it's such a strong color. And now that we have that mixed, we can just go ahead and lay it in for the whole thing. Don't worry about overlapping the lines. Just go ahead and put it in the whole thing, including the hooves. Just go ahead and lay it all in. And if you do it a little quicker, you can avoid overlapping tones. Because the color does dry as you're putting it in. And if you kind of rub it in a little bit while you're you're doing the flat wash, it'll help even out those edges. And it does not have to be perfect. You can see that I went out of the lines multiple times as I'm filling it in. Don't worry about that, because if you start being too obsessive, then you'll make mistakes. Or I should say bigger mistakes than you otherwise would. Okay. Put all that in here. And you can even go over the eye, just because that is also going to be just black. This is just a black horse all over. The only difference is that there's going to be some variation in the tones, and that's what we will use to help us emphasize details. Forgot the tail here. Okay. Okay, now we have to give that a minute to dry before we start layering in colors. So, in the meantime, we'll go ahead and we'll grab some more of the brown. And we're just going to add just a little bit of the cobalt blue. The reason being is, this brown is very light and saturated. And for the brown that we're going to put, it's kind of like a dirt path. Think of it that way. We're going to put it underneath the horse. That's what it'll be standing on. But if it's too bright, it'll actually distract from the object. Normally, I wouldn't be against using such a bright brown, but because there's not a lot of color in the object, it'll end up distracting from the whole piece. So we'll go ahead and we'll just lay it in like that. Almost like, imagine like you're painting in the shadow of the horse, so you're just kind of going in underneath it as if the sun is directly on top of it. And then what you're doing is you're stopping right around there. Rinse your brush completely, but leave it wet, so then you can kind of pull off the colors like that. And then if you press down on the paper, you'll get those nice textures from the paper. A little bit like that. And you can go back in, maybe add a little bit more color while it's still wet. But you don't have to if you don't want to. Okay. And rinse off our brush. Okay, so that looks good so far. So next thing, my brush is pretty dry right now, so I'm not adding any more water to the mixture that we have here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to directly mix in the shadows that I want to emphasize. Feel free to watch me do it and then proceed to try it yourself. But basically what we'll do is we'll start off here. You can see how it layers nicely because it's a consistent color. Kind of like that. A little bit here. And the hooves. And then same over here. Notice that I'm not filling in the whole thing because I'm imagining that there's some light getting through to the outside parts of the legs. And here in the tail, I'm actually gonna dry my brush off a little bit. I put a little bit too much in there, but that's totally fine. Especially since it's further back from our vantage point, it will be darker, so that's totally fine. I'm gonna add some here, like that. Kind of going with the curvature of the muscle, and then going down a little bit, outlining the bumps in the knee and down here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually rinse off my brush, dry it off a little bit, and then just pull that a little bit off of it, like that. Kind of create a little more gradation. And then use the same color to show, because the light is coming directly from the top. I'm going to rinse my brush again and then just kind of fade it out like that. So that way you have that transition of color. And then going in on this side, I'm going to leave that side kind of the bottom color. We don't want it to be too much. I'm going to rinse it off, dry it off, and then same thing, just kind of pull off, but then I'm pushing towards where the shaded part is. That way giving a little bit of variability in the shadow. And then getting more of the color. I'm gonna do that right here underneath the chin. And I'm also gonna add a little bit right here because there's a muscle there in the horse, so that kind of gives it more form, just like that. I'm gonna rinse off my brush, dry it off, and just kind of fade in that edge. We don't want it to be too harsh. There we go. If it's too harsh of an edge, it'll do one of two things. One, it'll just look unnatural, or it'll make the horse just look too skinny, like it's malnourished or something. Okay, rinse off my brush and then proceed with adding some of the shadows in the face. The face is tricky because you don't want to overdo it. You can easily kind of mess it up and make it look too bad. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a little bit down here and then a little bit where the mouth is, like that, leaving that space in between just to show that it's two parts basically. And do a little bit here and there and rinse off my brush. There's still some moisture in the brush, but I took most of it out, and then I'm just kind of fading out that edge just like we did before. Like that, like that. Maybe pull some of that up here, take some of that off. I rinse the brush, let it sit like that for a moment. What will happen with all watercolor, what happens is the colors always dry lighter. So we're just gonna leave that for now. And then we're gonna go back, get a little more brown down here. We already have the color that's set in. That's more desaturated, so we can just go ahead on top of that with our regular color and kind of throw some of that in there. Okay, rinse off the brush, same thing, dry it off, just a little bit of moisture, and then just pull it out, make it a little more interesting. There we go. Next, we'll go ahead and we'll work on the tail and the mane, and we're just gonna grab the black directly. Okay. Dilute it a little bit, and just put it directly over those parts. Like that. I realize that it does look pretty dark when you do that. Well, two things about that. In real life, that would be the case. It's actually, they're really, really dark. But also, it kind of helps separate from the body of the horse, the color, which is totally fine. And it will, as I mentioned a second ago, it will dry lighter. So we can go ahead and just fill all that in like that. Okay, rinse our brush. Normally I would add a background color, blue, obviously, but because this is a cool color to begin with, if we add blue on the back of it, it actually won't look good. So for this one, we're just going to leave the ground that the horse is on, and then we're just going to build up the darker values a little more, just to show more definition. And so we are going to add a little more pigment to this mixture without adding more water, because we want it to be darker. And so we'll grab the cobalt blue, maybe a little phthalo blue, and a little more brown. The more pigment there is in the mixture, the darker it is, and that's what we're aiming for. Let's see, and that seems pretty consistent with the previous color. Is just that it's just much darker. And so what we can do is we can go ahead and, like, let's say back here, we'll add a little more like that. Over here, a little more. It doesn't have to be everywhere. Definitely in the hooves, because the hooves are much darker. Okay. And add just some here, just to show that outline of the muscle. Some in here, maybe a little bit going down like that. The knee bumps here. Over here for the ankle. A little bit over here. Going inside like that. And also over here, just a little bit under the chin, not too much. You see, I'm very careful about overdoing it when going with the really dark shadows. The point here is to emphasize the colors, but not overdo them. And then a little bit over here, a little bit on the chin, just a little bit. Some of those folds, maybe here in the nostril like that. Some of those features in the ears. Okay, that looks pretty good. And the last thing that we'll work on is we'll go direct, just for pure black, directly from the palette. I'm going to go ahead and add some details like that. And it doesn't have to be too much, just a little bit. You can see the horse has its hair braided a little bit. You can kind of do some squiggly lines just to add the detail. Okay. Also, I'm just showing the shadow basically. A little bit back here. Here on the bottom. Maybe some short strokes. Outlining the texture of the hair. I'm going to rinse the brush. And then step back a moment. Okay, yeah, I'd say that looks perfect. If you have any questions or comments, just leave them beneath the video, and I will see you on the next one.